Or is Samia's class. We
Oh,
didn't finish the class.
that's all right. That's all right. I mean, I can, yeah, all right. MashaAllah, she is a beacon. She is a beacon.
Yes, Alhamdulillah. We enjoyed her class a lot.
I'm sure, I'm sure, I'm sure, I'm sure. All right, everybody. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we are right now continuing the tafsir that we're doing for Surah Al-An'am. And last time we went in details وَجَعَلُوا مِمَّا ذَرَأَ مِنَ الْحَرْثِ وَالْأَنْعَامِ نَصِيبًا فَقَالُوا هَذَا لِلَّهِ بِزَعْمِهِمْ وَهَذَا لِشُرَكَائِنَا. And we went in some details. Did I actually go in lots of details? Because we were talking about this ayah as and the set of ayat really exposing the people of Quraysh and how they were making their own legislation. I want you to underline this one, make a couple underlines. When we say they were making their own legislation, what does that mean? That means when you define culture, when you define justice, when you define righteousness, you define what makes integrity, you define all these different definitions. If your center is not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're going to be either depending on one side, in other words, one group of people determining the definition of truth or the definition of haqq or the definition of akhlaq, and they're going to be biased. They're going to have their biases, and then without you realizing, with you not having your resource. Remember this, you've got a resource, you've got their data, and you have your interpretation. So their resource was their own selves. Their resource was their own selves, and they said that they were their shuraka, in other words, the monks, their religious gurus, or whatever it is. They were their references. And the truth of the matter is that the reference was shaitan. So that led to confusing the data. And then later, of course, that gave the wrong interpretation in so many different areas, whether we're speaking about ritual or whether we're speaking about the definition of social relations or even the definition of justice in social relations. So I want you to look at this one. These ayat are basically exposing the biases, exposing the wrong references, exposing all the different cultures that, well, at least the different cultures that related to the wrong worship, and how that later resulted in the different biases, in the different wrong behavior, including, let's just say, so here it was basically letting us know in regards to risk, in regards to their provisions, how they basically had the wrong definition. They were given the wrong interpretation in regards to the wealth distribution, and it was basically given to them that in order to make a fair wealth distribution, that it would basically have to be one, that it was supposed to be for God. But the truth of the matter, that distribution was not even made for Allah, but it was dedicated for their gods. And when they would give something to the gods, they would dedicate it to the gods. So eventually, nothing was dedicated to Allah. It was all dedicated to their gods. In other words, all dedicated to their deviant gods, which they believe that they really did not create, but they believed that they were really inspirers, that they were an inspiration to take them to God, and yet their rituals were speaking otherwise. I thought you wanted this to inspire you towards God. So how is it when you're slaughtering something for the supposedly for God, you basically would say that this is given to those idols? And at the same time, when you would want to slaughter for the idols, you would say it's for the idols. So eventually, what you believe in terms of one, faith, two, worship, 3, all the different powers, you would attribute them to this idol. So then you're living in a whole contradiction, living in discrepancies with what you believe the truth in understanding God, or who basically defines truth and what defines truth. You're confusing all your matter. That's what those ayat are basically exposing in their aqidah. Well, it wasn't just an issue of wealth distribution or even in worship. It went farther than that. So the ayat then go and say, well, you know what? There's something else that I would like to expose in regards to your behavior. There's the social injustice that you were told to commit under the pretense that it was a way of thanking God, that it was a way of being a noble person. What was that? He said, well, I want you to remember, they beautified, they created a narrative, and that was for you. You were associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, your resources were these gurus. Your resources was completely off, that it later went and told you that it was a noble act to kill your own children. Why? It was presented to you that that was going to be a noble act to basically please the gods, to bring a pleasing life to you, to define you as a noble person, when the act itself was bringing nothing but social injustice, but more of poverty to you. You're basically eliminating your rizq. So here you are again. You're basically here, you created your own basically loss of rizq for these idols. In here, you basically eliminated what was given to you by God, your own children, by actually killing them. And these shayateen, these gurus that act on behalf of the shayateen, they made you think that this was a noble act. And this is extremely important, that all deviations, the shayateen, whether the human shayateen or whether the jinn shayateen, they would present it as if it's a noble act, as if it is something that you should be proud of. The same way how the LGBT presented it as pride. This is what they called it. It was an issue of pride. It was an issue of giving people that space of the space of being proud of having that self-presentation, etc. They're letting their own feelings judge what's right. And in other words, it's making them feel that they are the center of everything, when the truth of the matter, it was just a way of taking out some of their body parts. It was literally chopping off their body parts. It was chopping off, it was changing, it was inducing all these chemicals in their bodies, thinking that by forcing their their voice to change, or probably by changing certain appearances, that's going to change the reality of who they are. But that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know, that the shayateen, whether they were called doctors, or whether they were called psychologists, or whether they were called professors, or whether they were called gurus, or no matter what they were called, they can come in different appearances, but not until we have our resource right are we really seeing the things in their true reality, in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted you to see it in. That's the only thing that will help you see the reality. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then tells us, well, all of these different methods that they were using, it was going to be basically one, it was going to basically lead them to the wrong understanding, to the wrong definition, to the wrong interpretation. So we're talking about the wrong resource led them to reading their data wrong, and let them bring a wrong interpretation, and that created a lot of وَلْيَلْبِسُوا عَلَيْهِمْ دِينَهُم. It created a confusion. It created a new narrative that made it appear like it was covered with a noble act. It made it covered as if it was something that is basically giving you the space, the right, giving you the freedom, when the truth of the matter, it was taking you away from your own interest. It was taking you away from what benefited you. It was taking you away from rizq. And subhanAllah, shaitan, remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, الشيطان يعدكم الفقر. Shaitan promises you faqr. Shaitan promises you that if you don't follow his way, that you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose the future, your children's future, you're going to lose your house, you're going to use your health. Oh, you got to do it this way or else you won't achieve. And the shaitan will continue to give you this impression that not until you follow his way that you're going to be basically losing and not winning. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is يَعِدُكُمْ مَغْفِرَةً يَعِدُكُمْ جَنَّةً عَرْضُهَا السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is promising you repentance, promising you forgiveness, promising you Jannah, promising you rizq. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that shayateen will use different methods, whether it is through their representatives, they're called gurus, they're called psychologists, they're called these different politicians, whatever it is, or in motivational speakers, whatever, all these different words, they can be given different labels. But you want to be careful because they will use method one, they will confuse you in how you read the data. Method two, وَلْيَلْبِسُوا عَلَيْهِمْ دِينَهُمْ, they will confuse you in how you interpret the data. And then confusion three, فَذَرْهُمْ وَمَا يَفْتَرُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, you will feel that you need to adapt to them, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, listen, to get out of all of that confusion, there are certain areas, certain circles, you don't belong there. Certain friends you have to eliminate. Certain groups you have to depart yourself from. Certain people you have to boycott. You have to simply take them out of your life. Because if you don't take them out of your life, you're going to find yourself adapting that lifestyle. You're going to find yourself getting accustomed to their narrative, and without you realizing, it's going to take you into completely different vision, completely different identity. That's a key thing. That's going to take you into a completely different identity, and then you're going to be misunderstanding who you are, where you're going, and what needs to be done in order to get to your destination. Everything is confused. وقالوا هذه أنعام وحرث حجر لا يطعمها إلا من نشاء بزعمهم وأنعام حرمت ظهورها وأنعام لا يذكرون اسم الله عليها افتراء عليه سيجزيهم بما كانوا يفترون. Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving us more exposure to their behaviors and how they were creating all these biases, and they would give women certain things and men certain things, and then they would basically create those divisions, and then they would all create all this iftira'an alayh. They would attribute it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give them any of this interpretation, any verification, any validation, any approval for all this behavior. But then they would continue and actually say, well, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And certainly that's a confusion, and that's basically all something that they had actually made up. Okay, now when you look at these ayat, I want you to look at this one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned their behaviors, and here, let's look at this and what they had said. When you look at the Tafseer al-Qurtubi, we did do the general tafsir, let's look at Tafsir al-Qurtubi and how he explains things. He said, وَجَعَلُوا لِلَّهِ مِمَّا ذَرَأَ مِنَ الْحَرْثِ وَالْأَنْعَامِ. What did they do? Well, they basically, I'm going to go back right there, and al-Qurtubi said, well, when he said جَعَلُوا, what is جَعَلَ? جَعَلَ means to make. Okay, جَعَلَ means to make. But when you use the word جَعَلَ, it's different than بَرَأَ. Okay, what's the difference between جَعَلَ, بَرَأَ, and خَلَقَ? Okay, so بَرَأَ and خَلَقَ are very similar, but you want to keep in mind there's no such thing as a synonym in لغة عربية. A complete synonym, there's no such thing. But لغة عربية is so intricate that there would be a slight difference between this word and that word, and therefore sometimes they could be different stages, sometimes it's a different angle, sometimes it carries a new meaning, etc. But certainly when you look at bara'a and khalaqa, they would be close. Why? Because khalaqa is to create a creature, okay? To create a creature. That's khalaqa. Bara'a is to create to create out of nothing. Out of nothing. Versus bara'a, yes, to create out of nothing, but it basically also includes that it's to create, it could be matter, it could be living things, creatures, etc., all these different kinds of things. Okay, so bara'a is wider than the word khalaqa. Ja'ala is to make of something that is created. Is to make something out of, let's say, a living substance or a non-living substance. You would ja'ala. Okay, you would make of it. You wouldn't create it of nothing, but you would make something of it. So let's say you have the ingredients to make cake. Okay, well, you ja'alti, you basically, that's a ja'ala. You had the ingredients. You didn't create the cake. You didn't create the cake, but you used the ingredients that were there to make the cake. Okay, you didn't create the cake. Okay, now when you look at ja'ala, that's in order to let us know that they basically use different pieces of information. They used different ways of narratives. They used basically a number of different resources in order to create a narrative, in order to create a confusion, in order to create an interpretation, and therefore you would see the jahala. And this is important to keep in mind, that even in our society today, they'll use perhaps maybe certain scientific methods to confuse the masses. So whether we're speaking about today, changing the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, before they would chop off the ears while the animal's living, or they'll probably dedicate this animal, or they'll probably put certain things, tattoos in their body, etc. So it was really simple, really primitive changes. But during our time, yeah, they're using more sophisticated ways of fillers and injecting different things, and certainly surgical procedures, and certainly cosmetic things, and that's going way farther. In other words, it's using different tools to create. I want to use right now the word create, ja'ala, okay, to make a new transformation. Just because something is transforming in a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean that it had the control over the resources. Okay, keep that one in mind. It doesn't mean that it controls the resources, and this is extremely important. There's a huge difference between having certain data and you manage to make something out of that data. It could be a deviation. Just because you were capable of injecting things, or probably cloning, or probably maybe surgical procedures, or probably changing certain things, that does not make a new reality. That just means you had transformed something out of what was already created, but that doesn't mean you created and that you had invented something out of nothing. You had used the resources, you had managed to manipulate the resources, you had managed to completely change the resources and away from the data, away from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this for. Then in that situation, you're altering the data, altering the interpretation, and altering what this was made for. I want to look at this one because just because it's probably a doctor that is doing the procedure, it doesn't make it a medical procedure. It doesn't make it a healthy procedure. Just because it was somebody that is specialized in financing or what, it doesn't make it halal. It doesn't make it that it's acceptable. Just because this was given to you as an advice by a therapist, it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it that that's what Islam would approve it. It doesn't make it scientific. This is a key thing. It doesn't make it scientific. So I want you to look at this word ja'alu, because Islam wants you to go beyond these narratives and beyond the transformations that they are trying to make, or the confusion in using the resources. And Islam wants you to go beyond that. And Islam wants you to look at the resource. Are they using the resources right? Are they reading the data right? Are they manipulating the masses? What are they actually saying? So how do I know if this is right or not? Islam tells you, I want you to go back to the resource, Quran and Sunnah. I want you to go back to Tawheed. If it contradicts what Islam is teaching you, then you can be really sure that that was a form of manipulation. Then you can be extremely sure that that was a way that is taking you into a delusion. Don't let the rhetoric, don't let the narrative delude you away from reading the matters right. This is extremely important to keep in mind, because when you look at whether they're called gurus or whether they're called doctors or whether they're called therapists or whether they're called motivational speakers or influencers, and the list goes on, Islam tells you, listen, they can come in different transformations. They can come in under different labels. You have to be awake. You have to be basically going beyond those labels and recognize the truth by looking at the resource, reading the data right, and making sure that the interpretation goes in parallel with the resource that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you to understand things right. Okay, so when you look at ذَرَأَ, so what is وَجَعَلُوا لِلَّهِ مِمَّا ذَرَأَ مِنَ الْحَرْثِ? Okay. The initial interpretation. When you look at جَعَلُوا لِلَّهِ مِمَّا ذَرَأَ مِنَ الْحَرْثِ, what is جَعَلُوا? جَعَلُوا means to make. Okay, lillahi, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created of nothing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it of nothing. But then that basically means he is the creator. That's what it means. If he is the creator, then he should be the one that has the exclusive right to determine what this was created for and how it was created and the objective of why it was created. Then that was supposed to be exclusive for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give it the definition, to give it the purpose, and to basically give it the interpretation of how we define whether this is right, valid, not valid, whether this is basically the way that it was supposed to be used for, in other words, defining justice, etc., or whether it's not. But then what they wanted to say is that certainly they believed that Allah was the creator, but then did they give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the legislation? No, they didn't. Who did they give the legislation to? So they basically get given the legislation to their shuraka. What is shuraka? Shuraka, whether it was the gurus, the monks, their who knows, their motivational religious kind of like religious figures, they were the ones to give them the definition, and they were the ones to tell them what to do in life and what would please the gods, or what would make something as religiously acceptable or religiously not acceptable. What is that based on? It was really based on shayateen's inspiration. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know. He used the word dhara'a here and ja'ala here to let us recognize that there are these confusions that they had went into. One, they recognized that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created these things, but then they would give their shuraka, their gurus or their religious figures, basically the position to set the purpose for its creation, to set the objective, to set and define the definition of justice, when the truth of the matter is that they were just confusing everything. Okay, let's see. Mimma dhara'a, and that's why he said khalaqa. Because remember, the word khalaqa and dhara'a and bara'a, they have very similar meanings. Okay, they have very similar meanings. Okay, and it all goes around to creating something of nothing, but slightly different meanings right there. وَجَعَلُوا لِأَصْنَامِهِمْ نَصِيبًا. And from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them in provision, they basically would dedicate an amount of that money, an amount of whatever they probably were given, whether we're speaking about actual money in cash, or whether we were speaking about the different provisions, animals that they would slaughter for the gods, or perhaps their own children. And they would say, well, once you would have 10 boys, then you would have to kill one of these boys in order to dedicate it to the god. All of that was all made up. All of that is letting us know that shayateen are always using these ways in order for you to spend your effort, to put your energy, to put your wealth, and to put what was given to you in goods, to put it for their sake and not for your sake. It wasn't even for your sake. Killing your own children wasn't even for your sake. And that's the same thing. You know, yesterday I had a girl call me and she was basically telling me, well, it wasn't call, but sent a message, and basically fell in a haram relationship. And then this person promised to get married to her, but then she was afraid that if she were to say, hey, I repented, I don't want the relationship to go in a haram way, let's do it the halal way, that he might just decide to just leave her. That's shaitan playing the game right there, telling her, listen, if you don't abide by his wishes and by his preferences, he might leave you. What is the answer? Let him leave if he wants to. Guess what? You are seeking أولئك يدعون إلى النار. He's seeking nar. You are seeking Jannah. If he leaves you when you had decided to seek Jannah, then this person isn't right for you. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us in Surah An-Nur, yes, or actually Surah An-Nisa. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us, that yesterday we were talking about this, that for the believing men and for the believing women, that do not marry the mushrikeen. Why? The main reason is really because they are calling for hellfire. Their purpose is hellfire. Your purpose is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the illah. That's the key difference between you and them. All those different wisdoms that may surround this matter. Well, what's the wisdom? Why can't a Muslim woman marry a non-Muslim man? We'll say, yeah, well, because we want to make sure they're not, jeopardizing or risking or probably, using her kids, because kids are dear to their mother and men are more likely to give up on their kids than the mother to give up on her kids. So they're probably going to use that as a way to pressure you to give up on your kids or whatever it is, or probably give up on your faith, all of these different things. Those are wisdoms. The key reason to it is أُولَٰئِكَ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى النَّارِ. They call you for hellfire. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is inviting you for al-maghfirah, for forgiveness, for Jannah. So when shaitan is scaring you away and telling you, listen, if you repent, if you don't succumb to his wishes, if he's sending you a message and you're not answering, you're not responding, and he's asking you to come over and he's inviting you, that means he's just going to give up on you and he's going to get married to someone else. Well, guess what? If he is not accepting me when I had wanted to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he was accepting me when I was doing it the haram way, that's a shaitan. It's a shaitan. That's to let you know that this person is not a person of principle, but is a person that is using you as for his consumption. A person that is using you as a piece of consumption, that is a person that lacks integrity, that lacks piety, that lacks meaning, that lacks any sensibility. Don't want that. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also letting us know, that if the shayateen, they're basically leading you to putting in your rizq for the sake of those gods, and really the gods are not going to eat from them, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, you listen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is promising you, even when you donate to who? You donate to the fuqara. You don't donate to the shuyukh. You donate for the fuqara. You donate for the needy. You donate for those that are needy. That's basically to create within you a value of nobility, a value of giving, a value of hospitality. That's the value that you want to. It's making you a new, better you. It's making you a person of value. When you donate for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Islam, you donate to the poor, you donate fi sabilillah, you donate for a good cause. But their donation is a completely different dynamic. A completely different dynamic. It's just to feed their arrogance. It's just to feed the deviation. You're just losing money. And here you're losing your own beloved kids. For the sake of who? You're told it was for the sake of the gods. You're told it was to bring you blessings, when the truth of the matter, you just lost a beautiful, blessed child right there. That was the blessing. What is shaitan wanting to give you? He wants to take away every single blessing that you have. He wants to take away the potentials. He wants to take away the provisions. He wants to take away every single good thing that you would have, but he will put a narrative, just like he put a narrative for Adam, and he told him, أَوَلَا أَدُلُّكَ عَلَى شَجَرَةِ الْخُلْدِ وَمُلْكٍ لَا يَبْلَى. I'm going to show you off to a tree that would give you eternity. You're going to live forever. It's going to give you eternity. مُلْكٍ لَا يَبْلَى. It's going to be provisions that would never end. That's the secret behind the tree. And that's what shaitan will use. He will make you think that there is hope with doing what is haram, that there is life, that there is provision, there is success, when in reality, you're just losing your life. You're losing the purpose. You're losing everything that related to your own future in akhirah, in dunya. Okay, وهذا, and he said, وَكَانَ هَذَا مِمَّا زَيَّنَهُ الشَّيْطَانُ وَسَوَّلَهُ لَهُم. What is زَيَّنَهُ الشَّيْطَانُ? In other words, shaitan beautified it for them, made them that giving certain wealth to the gods, or whether it was certain slaughtering from their animals, etc., slaughtering it to the god and letting it go as a waste, that was basically a good, noble act. And he said, سَوَّلَهُ لَهُمْ. What is سَوَّلَهُ لَهُمْ? He made them think that it was appearing as if it was a noble act. And why that? And to the point that they would basically give from their own wealth, and they would say it was for Allah, when the truth of the matter, it was really going to their gods. Ibn Abbas, al-Hasan, al-Mujahid, they all said that, well, what was happening is that they would dedicate a certain amount of money basically they would say that it was for Allah, when in reality it was going for their gods basically. And then when it basically goes, look at this one, when, let's say, a certain amount of money would go for basically the religious keepers there, this amount of money, let's say somehow the certain amount of money was lost, they will deduct it from the money that was basically given within this religious institution of theirs. In other words, they considered that the religious institution was going to be responsible for whatever the money was missing. In other words, what are we talking about here? Did they basically give in replacement of that from their own money? No, because they considered that nothing to do with that. And therefore, all of that religious institution was basically abusing their money to make it seem as if it was for their sake, when in reality, it was these religious gurus that were abusing that money. They were abusing those positions. They were making those manipulations in order to bring a benefit to them. And not a benefit for the sake of the community or the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. It was not benefiting not them, and certainly not the community, but it was benefiting those religious figures alone. Okay, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, well, he's not in need of their money. And at the end is that what you would say was all nothing but blasphemy. It was all a delusion. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us see how history repeats itself. That you will see every single society will create a delusion and call it faith, will create a delusion and a manipulation and call it a noble act. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us see things in their crude elements in order to make sure that as a Muslim, you go beyond the narrative. That's the key thing, that as a Muslim, no rhetoric and no narrative is going to be fooling you, because you're seeing things in their reality. And that's why Sa'id ibn Jubayr, he basically was a student for Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas is basically the Prophet's cousin. He's the one that the Prophet had made the dua, Allahumma faqihhu fi d-din wa'allimhu at-ta'wil. Ya Allah, let him have the ilm in the deen, and let him have the knowledge of fiqh, the knowledge of fiqh fi d-din. Fiqh fi d-din, it doesn't necessarily mean Islamic legislature, like my specialty. No. Al-fiqh fi d-din at that time basically meant learning the intricate details of the religion and learning how to see within the words. In other words, you're thinking between the lines of whether we're speaking about tafseer or interpreting the religion or understanding the legal maxims, etc. That's basically the dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the Prophet had given Ibn Abbas. Okay, let's see. He said, quote, من أراد أن يعلم جهل العرب فليقرأ ما فوق 30 و100 من سورة الأنعام. until what ayah? Well, until the ayah قَدْ خَسَرَ الَّذِينَ قَتَلُوا أَوْلَادَهُمْ سَفَهًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. What did he say? He said, well, whoever wants to know the ignorance that the pagan Arabs were living in, then let them read all the ayat from basically the beginning of the surah until 130 plus 130 plus ayat. So we're looking at right there 136 or قَدْ خَسِرَ الَّذِينَ right there up until ayah 140. Up until ayah 140, that basically exposes the culture, the religious deviation that the pagan Arab and the people during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and what kind of deviations were they actually living in. Ibn al-Arabi, not Ibn Arabi, there's a difference. Ibn al-Arabi, a Maliki scholar, he said, وَهَذَا الَّذِي قَالَهُ كَلَامٌ صَحِيحٌ فَإِنَّهَا تَصَرَّفَتْ بِعُقُولِهَا الْعَاجِزَةِ في تنويع الحلال والحرام سفاهة بغير معرفة ولا عدل. الذي تصرفت بالجهل فيه من اتخاذ الآلهة أعظم جهلا وأكبر جرما فإن الاعتداء على الله تعالى أعظم من الاعتداء على المخلوقات. And okay, what is that saying? Ibn al-Arabi basically endorsed this interpretation, and he said, and what he had said is actually true. For they had basically used their minds. In other words, they used their own narrative. They thought that they were making a good interpretation or a good and a valid. They thought it was a valid interpretation explanation. But he said they had used their limited minds to interpret what is permissible and what is not permissible. But all of it is basically exceeding the limits with no knowledge and certainly no justice. And they had used their ignorance in taking the resources, basically in worshiping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the pagan idols. That was basically far worse in their deviation than actually taking the transgression in understanding the definition of social justice. So if this is transgressing, and you're capable of seeing how this is a real transgression over human rights and social justice, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting them know, well, if you're capable of seeing the social injustice, then the religious injustice is basically far more deviant, because that's what led to all of this. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically letting them know that the resource that you had depended on that led you to the implication of such social injustice is far worse than what you really need to correct. Mainly is your shirk into tawheed. Once you correct your shirk from tawheed, that's when you're going to understand social justice right. That's when you're going to understand the distribution, whether in economical distribution, or you understand social justice, or you're going to understand all those different things in regards to legislating right. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting them know that look at the implication of that injustice. It was really a result of the wrong resource. Your wrong resources led you to all these wrong. One, reading the data wrong, and two, making a wrong interpretation, three, a wrong behavior, and certainly a wrong discipline. If you're looking at akhlaq, remember we were talking about akhlaq. Are we using, let's say, the implication, or are we talking about the action itself, or are we talking about the foundation? What is really making something as right or wrong? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know, well, the definition of ethics is supposed to be based on tawheed. That's number one. That's the first definition that you want to really understand. Then, once you have your resources in place, then you're going to be capable of reading the data right. Once you have your data right and you're capable of putting it in where it belongs, that's when you're going to go a mile farther and you're going to read the interpretation right. Remember yesterday, I believe somebody asked the question, "Inna Allaha jamilun yuhibbul jamal." And I said, oh, that's using the wrong text in the wrong context. Using the, yes, in Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal, but that doesn't mean I would put in some beautification that would be for the context of husband and use it in the context of in front of my mahrams. That's the text in the wrong context. Beautification that you would put in front of your husband, that's in order to create a certain relationship, that's to create a certain, let's call it intimidation. But as a Muslim woman, you recognize that your resources in Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal, this is not to intimidate in a certain way that is a lustful way. So for my maharim, no, in front of my maharim, I would appear in a certain way that would create a certain relationship, a certain bond. But intimidating is a completely different ball game. That's the text in the wrong context. Okay, this is extremely important. How to put the text in the right context. This is key. This is look. Okay, let's see right here. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically, Ibn al-Arabi, he basically said, and what you were seeing here when they went into the wrong social wrong social injustice, or the wrong social injustice, is basically as an indication that their references had definitely gone way wrong, way off. So if the social injustice, you managed to see that it was not right, that's basically indicative that your resources are wrong, and therefore you would need to redirect. Then you need to redirect your vision, how you see things. So here the sister is saying, well, what does it mean? Inna Allaha jamilun yuhibbul jamal. Okay, so when you say Inna Allaha jamilun yuhibbul jamal, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beautiful. He loves beauty. Let's give an example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, خُذُوا زِينَتَكُمْ عِنْدَ كُلِّ مسجد. Here's one text. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, your beautification when you go to the masjid. What does that mean? So for the man, yes, probably put perfume. Wear your best beautiful abaya or jibba or whatever you call it. Okay? But men, وَلْيَخْرُجْنَ تَافِلَاتٍ. For women, they have to, when they go to the masjid, وَلْيَخْرُجْنَ تَافِلَاتٍ, they should not go fragranced and this type of beautification. You go into the masjid, we need you to basically go with all the different regulations in place in terms of hijab, in terms of what you're wearing. Oh, you're not going to be using Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal and I'm all basically dressed up in as if I was going to a wedding. Everything has its own context. Confusing the context is lacking fiqh. So that's why that ayah was basically tells us, okay, for men, in Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal, I want you to go and put some cologne, fragrance, all of when you go to the masjid. But for a lady, in Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal, now I want you to practice it with your husband. I want you to do it there because that is its context. That's its context. Let's see right there. It was mentioned that when you look at وَقْدْ رُوِيَ أَنَّ رَجُلًا قَالَ لِعَمْرُ بْنِ الْعَاصِ إِنَّكُمْ عَلَى كَمَالِ عُقُولِكُمْ وَوُفُورِ أَحْلَامِكُمْ عَبَدْتُمُ الْحَجَرَ فَقَالَ عَمْرُ تِلْكَ عُقُولٌ كَادَهَا بَارِيهَا. And what happened? So this man basically told Amr ibn al-As. You could see, I guess he wanted to use a condescending statement and wanted to somehow degrade Amr ibn al-As. And he said, well, to Amr ibn al-As. Who's Amr ibn al-As? Amr ibn al-As was a very intelligent Sahabi. And for those that would call Amr ibn al-As as a day to somehow degrade Amr ibn al-As and really give the connotation that he had evil motives, this is a Sahabi that even the Prophet ﷺ had endorsed in the battle of that Salasin and made him be the leader, even though he was only Muslim for 4 months. Amr ibn al-As was a Sahabi endorsed by the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so this man came to Amr ibn al-As and he said, even though you guys had kamali uqulikum, you were intelligent and you basically had, let's say, good intelligence, good minds, but then you actually worshipped stones? Like, how did you think of that? Amr ibn al-As said, well, those are those minds that their Lord had basically eliminated. In other words, what did he want to say? This is so smart. What did he want to say? He said, don't include me in this. They worship the stone, but if you wanted to guide me, and you wanted to say, well, yeah, you're probably intelligent, but guess what? Remember one day you've got a history that you have worshipped stones? That's what he wanted to say. He wanted to somehow degrade him. But he said, actually, as pertaining to those minds that worship stones, don't include me in this, because type of minds, those types of brains, the Lord Almighty had eliminated it. In other words, I'm not one of these people. I'm basically maintaining kamal al-uqul. I'm smart and intelligent enough. SubhanAllah, very smart in responding. He didn't let him degrade him. And he just said, for those brains, I wasn't actually part of this, even though he was. He was not mushrik. In fact, he fought against the Prophet, okay? But he did not want to be caught in this. And he said, as for those brains, for those minds, the Lord Almighty had already eliminated them. And basically, thanks for endorsing my kamal al-aql, my complete intelligent brain, and how smart we are. Thank you very much. That's Amr ibn al-As. You could never debate this guy. Okay, let's see. And of course, these ayat were basically just exposing the small-mindedness of the Arab and how their ignorance had basically taken them into the wrong interpretation, the wrong culture, the wrong legislation, and all of that. Ustaz Umayya, go ahead, dear. Ustaz Umayya, I could see you have your hand up, and
I'm just unmute myself. When he said تلك عقول كادها باريها, does it mean that when Islam come, it changed this عقول that used to worship the idol, then by
right? So in other
Allah
words, right, so here كادها باريها أي أرادها بسوء. يقال كدت رجل أكيده والكيد والاحتيال والاجتهاد. So in other words, it basically that the Lord Almighty, one, eliminated it, two, that despite all their intelligence, the Lord Almighty had went beyond their intelligence and basically had, despite all their intelligence, the Lord Almighty had basically managed to overcome and expose their ignorance. كادها باريها. So you wouldn't have been capable of outsmarting them, but their Lord Almighty outsmarted them and basically eliminated that ignorance. So what did he want to say? He said, actually, they're still smart. And their Lord Almighty, he was the one that was capable of outsmarting them and getting them right in the right direction. And here I am, Amr ibn al-As right now. I'm basically the one that is a part of what you had endorsed of a complete intelligent mind. And here I am. So this guy wanted to put him down. He wanted to basically say, you're stupid. But Amr ibn al-As wanted to say, okay, I'll use the first portion of your endorsement. When the ugliest way of putting somebody down is by making the place of endorsement be the place of putting down somebody. So if I say, oh, you're so smart, but You couldn't even pick up on that? I thought you were so smart that you were capable of recognizing that this is so wrong. What is that saying? Well, that's another way of saying you're so stupid. That's even way worse than saying you're so stupid, but saying your intelligence is basically not even there. All right, that's what he was saying. But Ibn Abbas is like, let me respond to that. Okay, you see that stupidity that you wanted to basically say? And thanks for the endorsement. You would endorse that we were smart and that we had these al-hilm. Al-hilm is basically like a mind. Okay, thanks for letting me know that we had the minds, and thanks for letting me know that we had the intelligence, and I'll just let you know that the one that outsmarted those minds is basically the Lord Almighty himself.
So he tried to mocking against Amr.
Absolutely, he tried to mock him, but Amr ibn al-As, you can't defeat
back.
him. You can't outsmart him.
Yeah.
You cannot outsmart Amr ibn al-As. He knows exactly how to respond. Okay. All right, let's get this is something that's really important. Al-mu'min kayyisun fatin. Al-mu'min is smart. Al-mu'min is intelligent. You don't get outsmarted like that. And mashallah, right now, we're actually seeing, especially Gaza, it really brought in a number of different new figures, I would say, right now in the field that are really right now coming in and getting known to us and giving us also the empowerment, to be able to respond in full power to whether it's the deviation or whether it's the genocide that Israel is doing, all of these different things. And we're starting to see new figures that speak in power, that speak in no fear, and that speak with good arguments. This is extremely important. Bring about this good argument. What he wanted to do, at least that man, he wanted to do what is called an ad hominem. What is that? It's basically when instead of attacking the argument and aiming at the argument, you're aiming at the person. But he didn't want to aim directly at Amr ibn al-As, so he did it in an indirect way and aimed at basically his people, the Arab then, wanted to aim it at that, but he wanted to give the inference that you're included in this. That, hey, yeah, you could be smart, but look at you. You couldn't even figure something that simple out. But Amr ibn al-As was like, tilka uqulun kadaha bariya, its own Lord basically outsmarted them and basically had eliminated such ignorance and brought an end to it. So getting back, thanks for the endorsement. Anyways, now this is smart, man. This is smart. Okay, let's continue right there. Okay. So what these ayat are basically exposing all the different jahiliyyah. What is jahiliyyah? Jahiliyyah can mean two things. Jahiliyyah can mean something that is of ignorance, and Jahiliyyah in the Islamic terminology basically means anything that comes not from the source and the resource of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's Jahiliyyah. That's Jahiliyyah. Anything that is not based on the resource of Tawheed and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's Jahiliyyah. If it's not from the resource of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's Jahiliyyah. If it's putting in confused data, that's Jahiliyyah. If it's giving me an interpretation that's not based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's Jahiliyyah. So whether we're speaking about the resource, or whether we're speaking about the data, or whether we're speaking about the interpretation, if it is not based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it's going to be Jahiliyyah. All right, and then of course, what we would see is that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting them know that that what we have to eliminate is basically these wrong interpretations, these wrong resources, and basically recognize that we have to go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to explain the definition of social justice, to explain the definition of truth, to explain the definition of legislation, to explain what and where the borders and the boundaries are, to explain the purpose, etc. And that's basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted them to get to. But one thing, I don't want to get into the details of what al-Qurtubi wanted to talk about in terms of بِزُعْمِهِمْ, that's another qira'ah, بِزُعْمِهِمْ, and the majority actually read it بِزَعْمِهِمْ, okay? And he said that وَهُمَا لُغَتَانِ. I want you to look at this one. When you say وَهُمَا لُغَتَانِ, in the modern Arabic, when we say lugha, we basically mean a completely different language. But it's really important to remember in the science of linguistics, certain languages, they basically have, let's call it the same foundation. So if you were to talk about French, for example, you're talking about Italian, Spanish, they would have the same source that goes back all the way to Latin. It's a Latin language. Okay, if you were to talk about Hebrew, you're talking about, for example, Syriac, you're talking about Arabic, you're talking about a Semitic language, then they would have the same foundation. This is important to keep in mind, that certain foundations, that they may have variations, they may have variations in how you would translate, slight variations here and there, but they would go back to the same resource. But certain variations within the same language, okay, what does that look like? So I would say, well, this classification is Arabic. This is all Arabic language. So whether you go back all the way, for example, to an Iraqi accent, or you basically go to a Moroccan accent, it all goes back to Arabic, but it's just a different way of articulation. Okay, it's a different way of articulation, but they would still call it lugha. Okay, it would still be called lugha, and this, in our modern times, they'll call it an accent. Okay, they'll call it an accent, or perhaps a different way of stressing on the letter, etc. But they'll basically use certain selective words. Okay, so a certain selection that really goes back to, let's say, the main resource, which is Lugha Arabiya. So you will see certain selections. Well, I would also like to say that a lot of the variant selections in different accents, they actually go back to, one, a certain Arabic tribe that spoke in a certain way. Okay, that's number one. Number two, later, some of those influences, maybe Italian influence, maybe French influence, maybe Turkish influence, those influences did happen because of political reasons. Basically, certain words, they infiltrated, maybe, let's say, the Lebanese accent, or the Palestinian, or or probably the Iraqi, whatever, infiltrated that. With time, it became something that basically is I would say, put within that community as this is the standard word that is used in that standard area, in that particular area. Okay, but generally speaking, when we say huma lughatan, that was something that the Quran itself approved, and that this was revealed through Jibril alayhi salam as a variant qira'ah. Keep that one in mind, as a variant qira'ah. So in other words, this ayah, where was the ayah? With this ayah, بِزُعْمِهِمْ فَقَالُوا هَذَا لِلَّهِ بِزُعْمِهِمْ, that this is a qira'ah. You could see Yahya ibn Wathab, As-Sulami, Al-A'mash, Al-Kisai, all of them recited it as bizu'mihim. In other words, this was approved by Jibril alayhi salam because of a variant accent that also reads in that way. So it's a valid qira'ah. Okay, that does not mean that it's alternating or changing the Quran. Okay, that's all we wanted to get to. Sa'a ma yahkumun, meaning basically right there that this is basically a wrong interpretation, and certainly reading the data in a wrong way. Okay, we're gonna get further than that. وَكَذَلِكَ, how much? Okay, it's basically okay. How much time do we have left? We basically have almost half an hour. Or should we end right here? Okay. وكذلك زين لكثير من المشركين قتل أولادهم شركائهم ليردوهم وليلبسوا عليهم دينهم. I don't want to go in lots of details with this one, but we're going to at least cover some things. And I wanted to say a very important point within this one. So what is this really regards to? زين لكثير من المشركين قتل أولادهم, that it was made beautiful. It was made as if it was a noble act to kill their own children. And what they were basically doing was, what do you mean killing their own children? Boys and girls? Yes. So some scholars actually said that the act and the ritual was, if they had a certain number of boys, that they basically had to dedicate one of those boys to their gods. That was one. That was one part of the culture. The second piece of culture, they used to commit infanticide and basically bury the girls alive, because they considered that girls are more susceptible to committing illicit behaviors, and they are more susceptible to perhaps get abused or probably somehow seduced by different guys. And then in that way, she's probably going to bring about defamation and going to ruin the reputation to the family. So in that situation, the best thing as a solution to basically risking our reputation, let's just kill these girls. So they would bury them alive. And sometimes it was مخافة العيلة. What is العيلة? العيلة is الفقر, is poverty. So how did they fear poverty? Why would they fear that by getting more girls, that was getting them into poverty? So girls were not the breadwinners. And certainly in a primitive society, it was depending on basically labor. It was depending on their body in order whether to crop or to work or to go out and probably engage in business or etc. It was dependent on their body. So if they had daughters, of course, the girls in a society that was a very harsh society, and in fact, even during our times, a woman's body, it basically goes through different stages of whether it's menstruation, pregnancy, nursing, all of that. That basically makes her dedicated towards her own family. Her body makes her centered around making family. So they considered that was basically just going to be feeding them, and that's going to get them basically losing money and not making money. So they considered that these girls are just an extra expense and not worthy of making as an investment. But for boys, they're going to be an investment, because these boys, they're going to grow, they're going to start working, the money is going to also come to the family, and then therefore, the investment is going to come back to us. But if the girl gets married, then her investment is going to be to her husband. And then in that way, it's not going to be an investment that I'm going to be benefiting from. So therefore, she's just going to be a burden, an investment to someone else. So that's what they considered as a good reason to avoid, one, this girl being a burden, two, this girl being financial burden, or even a social burden, or even probably maybe a social burden. The easiest way is to create a noble act and bury these girls alive. That's what they consider. You want to keep in mind that there are certain behaviors that the Arab, they were all they're very considerate over nobility, but they had considered certain actions as being a noble action. And by the way, it doesn't mean that the time of Jahiliyyah had no akhlaq. This is a very common wrong notion. The Arab had great akhlaq. What's the evidence? The Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا جِئْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. The Prophet ﷺ said, I had come to complete the gap of the good akhlaq that the Arab had. So they had great akhlaq. They had great mannerisms, but there were these gaps that the Prophet ﷺ needed to basically complete those gaps in order to correct it and make it a complete circle based on akhlaq and a foundation of akhlaq. Okay, so it's not that they didn't have akhlaq. They had very noble akhlaq, and they were very strict about the definition of nobility. I'll give you an example. When that king asked Abu Sufyan, he asked him about the Prophet ﷺ. He said, is he a person that you know at all, has a history of lying? He said, no. Abu Sufyan was so intimidated to lie at one point, but he said, I was afraid that if I were to lie, that those that are with me are going to hold it against me one day. So I had to say nothing but the truth. Why? Because akhlaq was a key thing within that society. Even when they had buried the girls alive, they buried the girls for what they had defined as a noble reason. They were so strict about their nobility that they thought, if this girl was going to come in and bring about a bad reputation for the family, we're going to need to get rid of her. But you also had others, just like you talk about Ibn Nufayl, Amr ibn Nufayl, that he was actually dedicating his home to taking these girls that were set for infanticide. And he would just take them in and be their guardian and take care of them until they would grow and probably get married or do something. But he would have his own home basically dedicated to just be their place of guardianship. That's akhlaq. Where did he get that from? Abdullah ibn Jad'an, another key figure in Quraysh. Let me tell you about him. He was not Muslim, but you know what he would do? Have you heard of Suhaib al-Rumi? Suhaib al-Rumi, just a little thing about him. Suhaib al-Rumi, his name is Suhaib al-Rumi, but he wasn't actually Rumi. What is Rumi? Rumi basically means Roman, meaning Western, what we'd consider today Western, meaning Christian at the time. Okay. They had invaded the territories of the Persian Empire, which happened to be including Iraq. Okay. The Persian Empire was exceeding all the way from, you're talking about Afghanistan, all the way to Iraq. Okay. All of that was actually considered a Persian Empire. This Persian Empire, of course, was considered as the key empire that was competing with the Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire at the time. Okay, so the Byzantine Empire, they invaded the Persian Empire, and the nearest area was basically Iraq. So this boy Suhaib gets kidnapped by the Roman Empire when he was basically in Iraq. So this boy ends up basically being kidnapped and growing in the midst of the Byzantine Empire. And later, Abdullah ibn Jad'an, Abdullah ibn Jad'an was not Muslim, but he had a noble act that he would do. One of these noble acts that he would do is that he would buy the boy slaves and he would just free them. He just wanted to make this dedication to set those boys free and give them the opportunity to probably, setting a way of finding privileges rather than get stuck in slavery. This is Abdullah ibn Jad'an. So Suhaib al-Rumi, he was lucky enough to have Abdullah ibn Jad'an basically buy him and then later free him as a good deed. Okay, as a good deed. So Suhaib al-Rumi later, of course, since he was a free boy or a teen, when he was introduced to Islam, that's when he had become Muslim. But you want to remember, this Suhaib al-Rumi, he later was considered one of the main businessmen. He recognized that me as an ex-slave, I wasn't gonna get any family to give me the support. So he had to basically pave his own way of support by making and advancing in business. So he was considered one of the millionaires in Mecca. And that's why when he had attempted to flee to Medina after becoming Muslim, that's when they followed him and they said, we need your money. Why? Because they considered that if he had taken his money with him, that was going to mean instability within the Meccan economy. So Suhaib al-Rumi basically said, you know what? You need the money? Is that what you're concerned about? It's in such and such jug in such and such area. They believed him and they actually went for the money. And that's why even in our times, they would basically calculate and say, well, how many millionaires left UK, or how many millionaires left New York, or how many millionaires are leaving and changing? Because when these millionaires go off to a new place, that basically creates a new economy, that basically stimulates that economy. So they were really concerned about the money. So once he told them about the money, he basically went off. So that's Suhaib al-Rumi. And why did I want to talk about Suhaib al-Rumi? I wanted to talk about al-akhlaq, that they had al-akhlaq. And that's when the Prophet ﷺ had basically said, Rabbi al-bay'a who's Abu Yahya? It's basically Suhaib al-Rumi, that he won the investment. He won the deal. What deal? He basically won his Islam over the money. That was the trade. It's like, I'll win my Islam, even if it means taking all the money. That's the price that you want? Yeah, sure. That's the ransom. You know what? Take all the money. As long as I basically win my Islam, that's all I need. And this is key for a Muslim. This is key, that it's all about a trade-off. It's all about a trade-off. What are you willing to give up on in order to win your Islam? What are you willing to give up on in order to win your children's Islam? What are you willing to give up on in order to win their future to Jannah? That's the key thing. Okay, let's see. And when it said that وَمَا كَانَ لِلَّهِ, okay, this one. زَيَّنَ لِكَثِيرٍ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ قَتْلَ أَوْلَادِهِمْ شُرَكَاؤُهُم. Okay, how do we understand this? So where's the object here? So who did this beautification? Who changed the narrative here? Was it the shuraka? Were they killing their own children, whether it was girls, boys, whatever it is? Were they killing them for their own pagan idols? Or were these narratives basically given by these shuraka, meaning their religious gurus or their basically religious figures, monks, whatever it is, and that they were the ones that were doing this tazyin, making these narratives and creating these definitions that basically were baseless? Who was it? Okay, so here you had some scholars actually say, well, this was speaking about those that were in service to the gods. In other words, whether you wanted to call them in service to the gods, whether you call them gurus, you call them in service to the gods. If it's a Jewish area, then that was going to be a synagogue, the rabbis, etc. And if you're talking about the priests, you're talking about the basically a church, or it doesn't have to be a church, but if you're talking about a priest, it can be different priests. Even during their time, they also had religious figures. They were considered as, hey, they were doing services to the gods, and they were the ones that were deluding the people. Or is this talking about shuraka'uhum, meaning just the general public? General public were they the ones that were shuraka? And in other words, it was a culture that was there. People were practicing it without knowing the resource in the base of this. And therefore, it was just all these people doing these behaviors. Or are those the shayateen? So regardless of whether it was, going all the way and tracing back to the shayateen, or whether it was a common culture that was trained or that was, taught by those that were in service to these gods, at the end of the day, it basically came from the same resource, that it was a delusion from a shayateen. Okay, and this is, of course, extremely important to mention that one. And then they basically would talk about al-wa'd, infanticide. Is this exclusive to the girls, or was this also to the boys as well? But at the end of the day, we already know the story when Abdul Muttalib, he basically wanted to make a draw on which of his sons he was supposed to be killing. And we know that the draw was coming to basically Abdullah, the Prophet's father, that he was supposed to basically dedicate him, that is, kill him and slaughter him for the sake of the gods. He would make a draw, and it was always bring out the name, the same name, which is the Prophet's father. But then he decided to go to these priests or gurus, and they would basically tell him, well, if you don't want to, implement this act, then on behalf of that, you can just donate 100 camels, good camels, basically, for the gods. Okay, so that's basically that story. Let's see. What I wanted to get to with it was this one as well. I want you to see that he said there are 4 different variant recitations in terms of this ayah. Is it كذلك زين, or is it كذلك زين لكثير من المشركين قتل أولادهم شركاؤهم, or is it كذلك, and the other قراءة is زين? Okay, what's the difference? What's the difference between zayyana and zuyina? If you were to say zayyana, that means it was basically telling me that this is the one, that this is basically the object. This is who created this narrative. The word zayyana means to create a narrative, to create a beautification, to make it seem as if it was a good, noble act. This is Zaina. But if you say Zuyina, that's a passive voice. What do you mean a passive voice? A passive voice basically telling you that he's not necessarily mentioning who is doing this, but it was basically something that was beautified to them to make it seem as if it was a noble act. But, I don't want to get into all the details of the different qira'at, but one thing I would say is that you could see that some scholars objected and said, well, this qira'ah is da'ifa and not necessarily a mutawatir, or not necessarily a strong, valid variant recitation. What I want to focus on, because if I were to go into all the different qira'at and all of that, one thing is that that's not my specialty, so I don't want to get into that. Number 2 is that in English, if I were to explain all the different grammar in it, it would definitely get me lost and get you lost. So I'm going to scroll over that, but I'm going to get to one key thing that was mentioned here in order to learn al-adab. Okay, that's the first thing, is that there was a qira'ah for Ibn Amir. And one comment that one of the scholars had made, he said, this is not valid in Arabic. And he said, وَهِيَ زَلَّةُ عَالِمٍ. وَهِيَ زَلَّةُ عَالِمٍ. I want you to look at this one. Why, when he said زَلَّةُ عَالِمٍ, did he say he was ignorant? No. He said it was a mistake that a scholar had done. And this is adab. Because he didn't negate that he was a scholar. but he called it a zalla. It was a mistake. It was a slip. And he then continues, وَإِذَا زَلَّ الْعَالِمُ لَمْ يَجُزْ اتِّبَاعُ وَرُدَّ قَوْلُهُ إِلَى الْإِجْمَاعِ وَكَذَلِكَ يجب أن يرد من زل منهم أو سهى إلى الإجماع فهو أولى من الإصرار على غير الصواب. يا سلام. A word of gold. What does it mean? He said, well, this is a slip of a scholar. Didn't indicate that he was a scholar. And he said, and if a scholar slips in making a mistake, we should not follow their mistake, but we should go back to basically what was considered as the basis of truth, which one of it is al-ijma'. What the consensus basically had agreed on is the basis of Islam. And he said, and this is the way that we should go back for every single slip or every single mistake that any scholar will commit, that we should go back to the consensus of where the scholars had agreed, and that is a resource that we would depend on, and that is a priority over being determined and basically determined in staying on what was wrong. And this right here, this quote, you read it of gold. He said, Zallatu alim. Didn't negate. It can happen that a scholar may make a mistake, but that does not mean we cancel them out entirely. But we would say, well, that piece of that mistake, that we would basically say, Zallatu alim. He's a great scholar, but that's a mistake, not acceptable, but I will still listen to his lectures. I would still take his ilm. I would still consider him a scholar or her a scholar, even if they had made a mistake. When do we basically cancel them out? If it's a mistake after a mistake and a serious set of mistakes, that's when we would question their credibility. If it's a series of mistakes, that's when we would question their credibility and who is basically to question and endorse basically their ilm or question their mistakes. It would basically be another alim. It would basically be another alim. They are the ones. And look at this one. Al-Qushayri responded and he said, هذا قبيح وهذا محال. Look at this response. He said, no. Yes, what you said is really beautiful, but he said, if we have a variant qira'ah and we have a valid resource to prove that this was valid, that's all that needs. If إذا ثبتت القراءة بالتواتر عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فهو الفصيح لا القبيح. If this was proven with valid resource, that this was a variant qira'ah, that it was basically read by a number of resources to prove that it goes back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, then this is what is al-fasih lal-qabih. What is al-fasih? Al-fasih means eloquent. Lal-qabih, not something that is basically to be rejected. So what is he saying? He's basically saying, well, if there's a resource to prove that this is valid and goes back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, then that's all I need. That's what would let me know that this is valid, that this is my reference, that this is my resource, even if the later rules of grammar basically did not find how they could, let's say, match their grammar to that. We wouldn't say we're going to cancel that out. We would say, well, your grammar needs some modification, or you need to fix your grammar, because you want to remember the whole idea of grammar that came later and not early. So grammar was later designed to help understand the function, to help understand the semantics and the structure of Lugha Arabiya. So we basically have to recognize the chronology of what came first and what came later. We don't change what was considered as fasih, what was considered as eloquent, and which is the basis in order to match what we later developed as semantics, as grammar, as basically the rules in order to basically fit the rules that we had derived based on the lugha. So that's why he said, no, if we've got the evidence, we've got the resource that proves that this is a valid variant recitation from the Prophet ﷺ, that's all we need. Watch it, just the adab of how we understand the qira'at and all of that. That's the key thing that I wanted to basically comment on. Let me see how many. Okay, that's it. So we're going to end with this ayah, liyurduhum. So what was the reason for that was the reason for their social injustice and their religious deviation? It was basically giving them al-halak. It was to take them into destruction. And this is key. وَلْيَلْبِسُوا عَلَيْهِمْ دِينَهُمْ, and they would basically order them. They would put them in doubt about their religion, about whether this was going to lead them to success, whether this is going to lead them to basically their own benefit and their own interest, or what the shayateen were basically trying to bring this delusion to warn them that if you don't follow my way, you're not going to get to success. If you don't take riba, look at you. You're basically going to end up living in this home that's all broken up, and you're going to end up with lots of probably mold and all of that. You need to take riba. There's no other way to do this. And or you need to do it the haram way, or else you're never going to get married. You need to get this haram job, or else you're never going to be able to make money. You need to stay in a haram country, or else if you go back to your own country, you're probably not going to make it, and you're going to live in poverty. الشيطان يعدكم الفقر. الشيطان يعدكم الفقر, and the shaitan will basically promise you. He's basically telling you, well, if you don't do it my way, you're going to get to poverty. You're not going to get to success. You're going to get to basically more and more struggle in life. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, actually, that's the way to Jannah. That's the way to success. This is it, inshallah, the end of for today's tafsir. Tomorrow, we're going to be, inshallah, continuing our tafsir. وَقَالُوا هَذِهِ أَنْعَامٌ وَحَرْثٌ حِجْرٌ. What is hijr? Is it hijr or is it hujur? Okay, we're going to talk about this tomorrow, inshallah. And what else? Let's see. وَقَالُوا مَا فِي بُطُونِ هَذِهِ الْأَنْعَامِ خَالِصَةٌ لِذُكُورِنَا وَمُحَرَّمٌ عَلَى أَزْوَاجِنَا. Okay, we're going to get to some things, but we're not going to stay long on those. You could see there's not much to say. It was just mainly exposing the deviation that they were living in. And then we're going to get to وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَنْشَأَ جَنَّاتٍ مَعْرُوشَاتٍ وَغَيْرَ مَعْرُوشَاتٍ. So stay tuned for tomorrow. I'm excited. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. If there are any questions before we sign off, go ahead, my friends. Ustaz Umayya, go ahead, dear.
Yeah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The last ayah, you explain it about 137. وكذلك زين لكثير من المشركين قتل أولادهم. Any example at that time that this happened, يعني وقعت بالحقيقة?
Oh, we have very many.
Yeah, just one. قتل شركائهم يردوهم أولادهم.
We have very many cases. The most famous one is that when Abdul Muttalib, like I said, he wanted to slaughter Abdullah, the Prophet's father. That's the most famous one.
Right.
But we also, the case that was told that Umar ibn al-Khattab slaughtered his daughter and that he buried her alive is not true. But there was another Sahabi. There was another Sahabi that would come to the masjid, and the Prophet ﷺ would see him, and he would be crying heavily. And he basically admitted this act, and that he had buried his daughter alive. Sumayya bint al-Khattab, who's that? Sumayya bint al-Khattab was Ammar ibn Yasir's mother. Her sister was one of those victims. She was buried alive by her own father. So that was one of those cases. And of course there were many others, but you could see that in the poetry, that's the easiest way to study their poetry during the time of Jahiliyyah, and it tells you a lot about how they even praise this act. So those were the three cases. I just wanted to give you three, at least to let you see how this was actually an act. And that's why the ayah was revealed, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, because this was a common act. When the girls that were buried alive, they would ask, what guilt, what harm, what sin have we committed for you to bury me alive? So this was something, these three cases, and also this ayah basically letting us know that this was a common culture.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, mashallah. Mashallah.
All right. So, in that, the story, the story of that man that was crying heavily, the Prophet ﷺ tells him, if I would have punished anybody for a sin that they had done during Jahiliyyah, I would have actually punished you for that sin. But of course, al-Islam yajubbu ma qablah. Islam erases every sin that was committed in the past. But he would always just feel so guilty. Why did I do this? All right. And, killing your own child, just imagine, and later discovering and knowing that it wasn't a noble act, but it was actually complete deviation, that Islam was telling you that was nothing but one of the worst acts that anybody could do. Allahul Musta'an. Okay, Iram, you had a question, dear.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Okay, one question I have, forgive my ignorance. I'm just wondering that which nation, is it some particular nation they are talking about, or it's just before Islam, Arab?
So this was more speaking about the Arab nation at the time, but this was not necessarily exclusive to that. So any nation that would engage in this particular act, and we say in Arabic, وَعَلَيْهَا قِسْ, and you're going to basically take that as an example, because this was a practice, but any deviation is basically going to go back in the same paradigm. It's going to be the same paradigm. There'll be certain priests or certain gurus or certain capitalist figures or certain media outlets or whatever it is, politicians, etc. They're going to be creating a narrative in order to make a certain act appear noble, appear right, appear acceptable. And then, of course, the masses, they would basically apply that in their life, whether that meant killing their own children or whether that meant killing a particular person doing a certain act. So we know already in archaeology, that, they would unearth or probably see the remains of past people, like in the Aztecs. They would put literally feces in the mouth of certain people and basically make them die with certain feces as a way of punishment. Or we would see certain bodies, they were tied up in a certain way, and it would be a whole set. You would see that the remains are telling us of certain actions. Were they buried alive? Why would you tie them up in that way? They definitely were resisting somehow that you needed to tie them up in a certain way. Or else, why would you need to tie them up in that way? Why would you need to insert something in their mouth? Why would you need to do certain things? So what we can see in archaeology is basically the remains of certain, whether skeletons or certain behaviors that, or at least the remains that would tell us of a certain behavior. We can anticipate, we can probably guess what was the culture, what was the behavior, what were they thinking, all of that. But the Quran was exposing that inwards and telling us that, there were certain behaviors that were practiced. At least this ayah was more referring to the people of Quraysh, but is it exclusive to the people of Quraysh? No. Maybe the Hindus were doing the same thing. I don't know.
Right.
Maybe
So we
the
can't
people in
fix.
Japan were doing the same thing. I don't know. But this particular ayah was referring to the people of Quraysh.
36 and 37, I mean, when they were, right, these ayahs mean you are talking about 136 and 137 we just did today, right?
Right. Well, no,
Okay.
we're going to see down the road how it would be talking about Prophet Musa alayhi salam. We're going to see that down
Yeah,
the road.
because I was in that in Menti, I was in that nation, and then I realized, no, this is something different, because I think we read somewhere comment I mean, as I remember it lately, we had discussed. That is why I thought this is the nation of Musa. Then I realized, no, this is not
Right. Now
there.
we're going to see down the road in the ayat, it will take us back to Prophet Musa alayhi salam.
Yes, I also remember something like that.
Right. So you could see that the ayat sometimes may discuss one thing, let's say in terms of Bani Israel, and then later on it will say, well, you know
Yes.
what, that's the same paradigm. That's the same behavior. It traces back to the same idea of Bani Israel. And then it will tell you about Bani Israel. And then it will tell you, well, that traces back to the same action that Qawm Lut were doing, etc. So we'll basically use a number of different examples and a number of different paths in order for you to trace Jahiliyyah, whether in terms of resource or whether in data or interpretation or in terms of action. It will tell you, well, the shirk and the loss and the deviation, it may vary in the labeling that in the presentation that it might actually be in. This may be called Judaism, that one might be called maybe the time of Lut, or that one might be the time of Prophet Nuh. Maybe that one is the time of your time in our modern time, or maybe that one was the time of Bani Quraysh or al-Arab, but the idea is the same. That's what the ayah is basically saying. Those ayat are letting us see the paradigms, that the deviation can have different appearances, but the deviation basically goes from the wrong resource. And the deviation is really one. It's shaitan. Deviation is really one. It's shaitan. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us recognize where each and every single one of these deviations are basically tracing back to. So just by calling it Judaism, or calling it basically the time of Arab, or calling it maybe in India, or maybe calling it somewhere in Japan, or maybe calling it in the Arabian Peninsula, or Christianity, whatever it is, it all traces back to the same deviation. So now down the road, we're going to see the ayat are taking us to the same trace and telling us, okay, here's Bani Israel. Now let's talk about you, because you carry the same paradigm, and this is how you had gone wrong, and let's expose that. And you're going to see down the ayat, you're going to see it.
Right. Here it is mentioned like in 136 in the beginning, وَجَعَلُوا لِلَّهِ. So I mean, who was Allah for them? Here it is mentioned that something they just like put for Allah, and something for their gods. Like
Fair enough. So they did believe in God, okay? But they believed that these idols, as in Surah
idols,
Zumar,
yes.
Zumar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, it basically tells us, in quoting them, that وَقَالُوا مَا نَعْبُدُهُمْ إِلَّا لِيُقَرِّبُونَ إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفَى. They said the reason why we're worshiping all of this is because it gets us near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they created a narrative why they had seen these idols were an inspiration to get them closer to God. It's the same thing if you were to talk to a Catholic, they'll tell you, well, I don't worship the icon itself, but it inspires me to think of Christ. Okay, so that's the same idea. It's an inspiration. They would present it as if it's an inspiration and that it's basically to bring them closer to God instead of seeing a remote God and feeling a remote God. That's the same thing, but Bani Israel and what they wanted. What did they want? They said, اجعل لنا آلهة كما لهم. How come they, the Canaanites, the Canaanites, they had these gods and they basically had something that they could see, they could sense, they could relate to. And instead of our God being remote, we don't want a distant God. We don't want a far God. We want something that we could see, we can sense. So that's when, of course, they heard this ram, basically a golden ram, start making sound. They're like right away, just ducked down and started prostrating to it and said, okay, this is the God. So what did they want? They basically wanted to create something because it's not that Allah is distant, it's that they are distant from God. That's what the ayat are basically letting them know. It's not that God is distant. God is not distant. You are distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the key thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that what He is al-Razzaq. He is al-Hayy al-Qayyum. He is basically Qareeb. He is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Qareeb. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator. He's basically the one that controls all the forces that surround you. He is Qareeb. But if you are distant, then it's not that God is distant. But what they wanted to do is that they wanted to change the narrative and basically say, well, I want something that is near. So they created some kind of a resemblance because they are just worshiping God, to feeling God, gives them that inspiration to relating to God, etc. By doing what? Well, by creating, whether it's a doll or whether it's an image or whether it's a certain human figure that they will say that he resembles basically God's knowledge or the spirit of God or whatever it is. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us see that their distant behavior, they're the ones that were distant away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then they would create a way that they would claim that it was to inspire them to get near to God, when in reality Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not the one that is distant, it's that they are distant. Did I answer the question or did I go far?
Yes, right. Exactly, you did. And secondly, one more important thing, major thing that I noticed, they bury their daughters. So it was even, it is as old as we could say Bani Israel. It was very old.
Well, Bani Israel, I don't know if they buried their daughters. I don't know if that was a ritual that they practiced, so I can't answer that one. I do not whatsoever remember anything of that sort, that they had practiced a ritual of burying daughters whatsoever. I would ask if there is of any resource of that, but not that I know of whatsoever. But it was definitely a practice that the people of Quraysh were doing, and we have records of that, whether in their poetry or whether the Sahaba are confessing that there was a history of a practice that they had done during their time of Jahiliyyah, or that they were basically saying that this was a common culture that we were basically practicing. So in other words, it was a testimony of their own past, of their own culture, that they were basically telling us, and even the Quran basically telling us, keeping track and keeping that of records, that was a culture that was common during that time.
And here is Katla Oladihim. So it means, so they could be, it's Oladihim, it means whether it was baby boy or baby girl. So they were.
Right. So Katla Awladihim, like we said earlier, scholars had differences of opinions on whether this was exclusive to it really referring to infanticide female. female burial, in other words, killing the girls, or whether this was inclusive to include the boys, because we have when you say أولادهم, you could see that it's more inclusive because it's coming in as a plural form, meaning that it wasn't just exclusive to girls, but it was also including boys.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And one more last question. You told the word bara and zara'a, and then I know the difference between ja'ala and khalaqa. So this bara'a and zara'a, these two words, they are in the category of khalaqa, right? So I mean, if you
right,
ja'ala is the
when the khalaqa are within the category to create something of nothing.
Right.
Ja'ala is to basically make of something.
Right. When ingredients are already available, that is ja'ala, right? So those three are in one category, and ja'ala is in, like,
absolutely,
we can get it. But that's it. I want to confirm. Right.
Just like
sayyara,
sayyara and sara, that also goes within the category of ja'ala.
Right.
Sayyara and sara, because sayyara actually means to make something, you're transitioning something. So sara, meaning that they had transitioned into something, or it's to make something new of what is already available.
Right. Do you have something to write? I mean, can you write these two words? Because these are two new words for me. You say Sayara. Yeah, these do you have anything to write here?
Sara, that's Sara right there.
Okay, right.
Not Sara, because the scene, the Sara, this one means to basically go into motion. But Sara with a Sad basically means a transformation, to transform, to become.
Right.
Okay? So this and Ja'ala.
Right. Right, yeah. Okay,
all right.
So thank you very much. I mean, I
Allah
don't have words to say thanks. I mean, every time in your session, Tafseer session, I mean, this is of more interest for me. I learned so many new things, even linguistically, linguistic things in Quran. I learned those things and not many information. I mean, all the questions they get filled. Okay, I get the answer of many things. And by the way, I mean, you have made it easy. Even if we have tafsir, tafsir Qurtubi, I try to read it even in my own language, Urdu language. I was not able to understand, but now the way you explain, yes, now if I read now, I can read it, I can understand it much better.
MashaAllah, Allah yahfadak ya Rabbi, and barakallahu fikum.
Alhamdulillah, and I'm really thankful to you. Jazakallah khairan. May Allah reward you a lot
Ameen,
in both worlds. Ameen.
Ameen ya Rabbi.